Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars Legends lore video. Just a gentle reminder that Corey and I will be filming another episode of TapCaf Transmissions tonight, and for those who don't know, TapCaf is our Star Wars EU podcast. It's in book club format, I guess. Every 2 weeks we read a new book, then discuss it, and we usually take questions from you guys. It's a whole lot of fun. Tonight's episode will be streaming on Corey's channel, but you can also download it later or watch it on YouTube, and I'll put a link to the traditional podcast services down below. For today's episode, I've been reading Dark Force Rising, which is book 2 of the Thrawn trilogy and one of my favorites. It was in reading that I actually got the idea for today's video. How can Jedi, Sith, or other Force users affect spacecraft and even turn the tide of space battles? The Thrawn trilogy heavily features a character named Jorus C'baoth, and as a very powerful Force user, he does lots of things that we'll talk about in today's video. Let's start with Dark Force Rising. C'baoth was really gifted when it came to the art of sensing people, reading their mind, and even affecting their way of thinking. The whole time he interacts with Luke, he's basically able to keep him in a very suggestible sort of brain fog, and when Mara Jade approaches his base, he does something very similar. He reaches out with the Force and basically clouds her mind. She gets disoriented, she says she feels like she's half asleep, so much so that she actually almost crashes. She's only able to escape his influence because of the presence of Isla Miri, but I have no doubt that if Jorus concentrated his powers on most individuals, he could break their concentration enough that they would crash. But especially as she gets closer to the planet's surface, he also keeps it simple by throwing rocks and boulders at the spacecraft. That seems simple, but it's true. Jedi often did throw projectiles or objects with the use of the Force. In fact, the Jedi Stealth X was even armed with a weapon that was meant to be controlled and launched using the Force only, the Jedi Shadow Bomb. These were extremely powerful starfighter munitions usually used on Stealth X's, and a Jedi would, as I said, launch them, then control them on their way to the target with the Force. They worked well for Stealth X's because they didn't give off the same type of sensor data that launching a missile would, for example. But back to this sort of brain fog, there are a whole host of mental powers which can be used against opponents. Also in the Thrawn trilogy, we see on one occasion Luke use the Force to mind trick enemy TIE fighters into not attacking him. However, he's very reluctant to do so after he does the first time because he realizes that interfering with the being's mind skates very close to the dark side. And I want to do a whole video on that because both the practices of mind reading and Force suggestion are true dark side powers. They're essentially messing with a person's brain and, more importantly, their free will. Yet Jedi do this all the time. Some books have Luke be very careful about this, others not so much. However, purely mental Force powers take many different forms. Next up, I want to talk about the related powers, or at least I would call them related, of battle meditation and Force melds. Let's start with the former. Battle meditation was essentially a technique which improved almost all aspects of friendly fighters during a battle, at least when used by powerful Force users. For example, returning to the Thrawn trilogy, we see that Jorus C'baoth is able to markedly increase the speed, efficiency, and effectiveness of basically every aspect of a Star Destroyer, because the individuals working each post are essentially being supplemented by the Force. But this isn't limited to a ship-wide level. We see, for example, that Bastila Shan, who was particularly gifted in the technique, could alter the course of battle simply by using battle meditation and supporting one side. Now, although this isn't technically affecting other ships physically, it certainly does impact space battles, and a ship aided with battle meditation will always win against a comparable ship without. Some, like Jacen Solo, took this to the next level. Jacen didn't only coordinate local fleets, but use his Sith-enhanced battle meditation to see the progress of the war overall. He would see events happening before they actually did. With the shifting tides of war being represented directly by the Force, he would see where the enemies were going to attack, he would see what kind of fleets they would bring, and he would know where to move his own forces. Some, like Jacen and Palpatine, could even influence their own armies and navies from across the galaxy, and thus, as I discussed in a prior video, became essential to their faction's war efforts. That sort of mastery, however, was comparatively uncommon to the already rare standard battle meditation. Relatedly though, we have Jedi melds, and this is a sort of similar principle. It's about increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of a fighting force through the Force. Whereas battle meditation is essentially a powerful Force user imposing their will onto others, battle melds instead usually involve multiple Jedi, although perhaps Sith as well, using the Force to fight almost as one unit. They can communicate instantly, they can see the actions each other's about to take, and they can almost unconsciously plan and execute strategies. Keeping on the Zahn train, the outbound flight was an example of a capital ship manned by Jedi, which heavily used battle melds. Jedi would man the turbo lasers and would control the ship. They would all work in unison, making the large ship even more devastating in battle. We see battle melds appear again in the new Jedi Order. Jacen, Anakin, and Jaina, for example, used it to great excess during the Battle of Debrillion during a famous scene in Vector Prime. The technique was used very highly, especially by Jaina's fighter squadrons during the Yuuzhan Vong War, and even more heavily during the Second Galactic Civil War. During this era, perhaps more than any save the late Clone Wars, we actually saw Jedi used in starfighters very frequently. In the Swarm War, we see that Luke is able to use the Force to physically hold ships in place as he targets them with his starfighters' cannons, something that I think would be very, very difficult. Admittedly though, this is a similar principle to what we see in The Force Unleashed, with Starkiller pulling down a Star Destroyer, with the general principle being, well, you're just using a normal Force power, but in a very extreme way. Another very famous example of this came in the post-Endor Galactic Civil War period. Luke had just established his Jedi Praxium on the planet Yavin and was training his first class of students. The base is attacked by a fleet which had been ordered there by Natassi Dalla, and which included over a dozen Star Destroyers and several support ships. The Jedi Dorsk 81 stood on the top of the Yavin Temple while all the other Jedi basically funneled or channeled their power to him. Using a massive Force push, he literally pushed the fleet out of system and away from the planet, saving at least temporarily the Praxium. However, unfortunately, the effort was so great that Dorsk 81 would eventually die. The Empire would actually return, including Natassi Dalla and her Night Hammer, but the sacrifice was such that the New Republic had time to send a fleet to protect the Praxium. Finally, we have a Sith-only power. However, before we get to that, I think I should touch on meditation spheres. Meditation spheres, like the vessel known simply as ship, were semi-sentient starships powered by the dark side of the Force. They could operate on their own, but ultimately were servants of the dark side and would listen to powerful Sith, or I guess other dark side users as well, because we know Abeloth also was able to bend ship to her will, although unwillingly. Meditation spheres were not only deadly in space combat, but also naturally amplified the effects of battle meditation and just helped with running the Sith Order, training apprentices even sometimes, as we see the meditation sphere attempted to do with Ben Skywalker. However, that brings us to our final power, which is Force Storms. We see Force Storms pretty much only in Dark Empire. In Dark Empire 1, a Force Storm ravages Coruscant, and controlled by Palpatine, also transports Luke to an Imperial ship. Whether it works through hyperspace or some other wormhole isn't currently known. However, that was only one technique, and Force Storms could also be used as an offensive power. The Nebulon B frigate Antari 6 was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was utterly destroyed by the Force Storm. Later, Palpatine creates a second one, which he loses control of during his duel with Luke and Leia, and which consumes his Eclipse-class Super Star Destroyer, as well as several other vessels. Arguably, this is one of the most powerful darkside techniques in Star Wars, not only in the context of space combat, but just generally, and it certainly takes a master and a very, very powerful being to properly harness them. Aside from that, going to canon, in the new Star Wars trailers, we see lightning near the Sith fleet, and I think it's very possible that that has something to do with Palpatine, which takes me to my general point. Any Force power really can be used to harm a capital ship or turn the tide of battle if used in a creative way, as we see with Sabaoth and his brain fog and his hurled rocks. We're not only talking about the things I mentioned on today's list, although I do think that gives a really good introduction to the topic. But did I miss anything? Which one of the techniques I talked about is the coolest and is your favorite? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments section. Today's video is going a little bit over 10 minutes, so I'll hold off doing a hashtag AskEck question of the day, but if there's anything you'd like me to answer in a future video at the end, leave it down below in the comments with the hashtag AskEck. Anyway, until next time guys, that's all I have for you. Have a great day, and as always, may the Force be with you.